It is my pleasure to introduce artist and photographer Ben Huff. 11 years ago, Ben had his first solo show at the Alaska State Museum. That show, titled The Last Road North, was a series of photographs he made on the Dalton Highway. One of those photographs, 488 Mile, Approaching Dead Horse, is currently on display in the museum's exhibit that opened tonight, celebrating 20 years of Alaskan art supported by the Rasmussen Fund, Alaska Art Fund. In 2021, Ben's second exhibition at the museum, Atomic Island, was a portrait of abandoned World War II and Cold War naval outposts on the Aleutian island of Adak. Tonight, Ben will talk about his new series, The Light That Got Lost, and his work with the Juneau Icefield Research Program. Ben, thank you for being here.
Hey everyone, thanks for coming out tonight. I know it's a busy night, there's a lot going on, and I'm really pleased and honored to have everybody here. Last time I was here with the Atomic Island show, we did a lecture after the event, and Jackie had to come get me next door. I was in a conversation over there and kind of lost track of time, and I got here and I was a little winded and sort of felt like I was shot out of a cannon and kind of stammered even more than I'm doing right now to kind of get started. And I think I recollected the moment that I sort of failed to thank a few people. Jackie I've known kind of since the beginning here and has been wonderful to work with, her and Aaron, on the physical exhibitions. If you've been next door and just walking through those shows, the Rosenthal show right now, I can't even imagine with all those pieces and all that writing. Addison, who's always been a great champion of my work, Steve, who chose the dead horse photo next door from that first show in 2011, and to the friends of the museum, library, and archives. That board, which I was on for a short period of time, it's difficult and long and thankless work, and I just wanted to take a moment to notice and to thank them that this kind of thing doesn't happen without them. So thanks to them, and if you're a member of the Friends, thank you as well. If you're not, consider doing that. You can find, I saw Carol running around somewhere. She might still be here, skipped out, but you can find one of them to become a member of the Friends. So let's have a chat tonight. Done one other lecture here that wasn't after an exhibition, was kind of an interim lecture, similar sort of series, and during that time, I talked about a really early project that I was doing out in Adak. I don't even know if I sort of had a title for it at that point, and I think I stood up here most of the night and said, I don't really know yet what I'm doing, but here's the beginning of something that I'm still sort of confounded by, or I am confounded by. And then a few years later, showed the work here and had a book published, and I've shown it elsewhere. But I'm kind of back to the drawing board a little bit tonight, so bear with me, but I'm going to sort of, to some degree tonight, sort of be a little bit in that space of not entirely knowing where I'm at, and that this is kind of new work. I've been working on it for a while, but like I do most times, I'm going to step back for a second and sort of do a little bit of history and kind of back into this a bit before we get into some of the newer pictures. Dee and I, my wife, moved to Juneau from Fairbanks in the winter of 2010. Made our way out to the Mendenhall Glacier that next summer, 2011. I've been on glaciers in Alaska before, right? South central, the interior. Hiking out the West Glacier Trail, scurrying up over the rocks and sort of seeing the glacier for the first time was kind of a big moment, I think, for myself. I'll speak for Dee, I hope for Dee as well. Because being in Juneau, there was sort of this I guess, this sort of feeling or this sort of knowledge that, especially as a photographer, that I had the opportunity, being in Juneau, to have this sort of intimate relationship with this glacier if I sort of chose to have that, right? That it wasn't something that I was gonna have to hop in a car and drive all the way down to Gulkana from Fairbanks or into the Alaska Range or what have you, right? That it was something that was close enough that if I wanted to take the time and make the effort, I could have something that was that felt intimate. Made some pictures that day, kind of pictures I think that everybody makes, nothing spectacular, sort of snapshots, tourist pictures probably. Went back to the glacier several times over the next couple months. And what I was sort of struck by during that time was that the elation that I found seeing the glacier for the first time was supplanted by this sort of state of almost mourning after I continued to go out, right? This knowledge that the retreat of that glacier was such on a human scale, right, that it was breaking down daily, weekly, monthly, and I was having a really hard time sort of reconciling with that as a photographer, and sort of settled into this sort of thinking about the glacier, more about the space around the glacier, and thinking about this idea of absence, right? And kind of less about the glacier and more about photography, and sort of thinking about photography and thinking about this idea of portraiture and making portraits not of a person but of a thing. And could you make a picture of a thing without actually making a picture of the thing, right? Could you make a portrait of a place without showing the sort of the central focus of that place? And I did that for a while, and even when I was showing the glacier, the pictures were, you know, either a little bit abstract or muddled in you know, dirt and sand and silt and muck, and it wasn't the sort of blue and the white of sort of our dreams of what a glacier looked like. Made these pictures for a while, and ultimately stopped. Sort of felt like, at the time, I felt like maybe the work was just wasn't sort of up to, or sort of wasn't as sort of weighty as the idea, I thought, right? That it was sort of crumbling under the idea of what I thought the work was, this idea of sort of absence. Put it away for a while, didn't think about the landscape, was off doing other things, went down DADAC, was working on other projects. And then a few years later, Dee and I were running Blackerby Ridge, out Blackerby, up over Obbs, and back down into Granite Creek. And going there along the ridge, where we go along what I know now to be Lake Linda before you get to Obbs, kind of looking down Lemon Glacier toward Nugget, and kind of in that saddle between Vesper Peak, which is up to the left, and Karen, that you come over to kind of get down to the low part to go over to Obbs. I saw these buildings down there, these sort of glittering little silver, like just these little jewels sitting on this little rock outcropping in the sun. And they looked so sort of foreign and romantic and kind of beautiful. And I asked Dee at the time, like, what do you think those are, right? Like, there's obviously no one there. They look sort of cared for, kind of not cared for, right? They look like they're almost ready to sort of blow into the ptarmigan at any big gust of wind. Went back into town and sort of asked around to try to figure out kind of what was going on up there. Long story short, found out that this is Camp 17, the first camp in a series of 4 large permanent camps on the ice field between between Juneau and Atlin, BC. And there's an 8-week-long field season, research field season of students, about 32 students, 8 or so staff, about 50 students, staff, and faculty at any given moment that travel from Juneau to Atlin, BC every year. And I found myself, really long story that I won't take up here, found myself with that program in 2015, and then later as faculty with that program, going back up onto the ice with them every summer now, since 2017, I guess. The pictures I'm going to show today are largely from my time spent with JERP, and we'll talk a little bit more about JERP here in a minute. That's Obbs and Winter, just another little reference point looking across Lemon Glacier from Camp 17. So let's orient ourselves for just a moment. I have a pointer, but I'd rather not use it. We're obviously here, right? Mendenhall Glacier, that tiny little nub, which now isn't a nub, right? Now it's this big sort of convexity of water. That was sort of the starting point for sort of this project for me. But Camp 17 travels up to Camp 10 on the Taku Glacier, up to Camp 18 overlooking the Gilkey Glacier. Camp 28 is on the Canadian border, and then Atlin Lake and Atlin up to the north. The pictures, we're going to end with some pictures back in the valley, kind of wrap it around, but the pictures today are all going to be somewhere in that landscape. So sort of discovering the program and sort of discovering this sort of merry band of travelers that travel 85 or so, 190 miles from, depending on sort of different field days, but travel from Juneau to Atlin every year, and finding myself sort of in that program as a faculty teaching photography and teaching art and teaching science communication among scientists and among students, is kind of where this work begins to come from. Aerial picture of the backside of Mendenhall Towers. A lot of time in, not a lot of time, but the field season is only 8 weeks. My time up there is 1 or 2 or 3 weeks any given summer, which is a pretty short period of time to sort of be, all year thinking about sort of a long-term project. When I can, I do aerial photos in the landscape as well. The thing that was sort of kind of the linchpin to the project for me, and the thing that I think enabled me or is enabling me to look at it as a long-term project, right? I think in retrospect, one of the reasons why just focusing on the Mendenhall at that time, all of the projects that I've done to this point have, there's always an element or a sort of not a conflict, but there's this sort of tension of sort of people living on sort of the edge of wilderness, right? Whether it was the Hall Road and people using that road, as either a resource route to get things to the oil fields, or people just driving that road because they could, right? The idea of just driving as far as you can just because you can, and you get to the end, and sort of the physical and metaphorical end of the road in that book is oil. Or the sort of suburbanization through the military of an Aleutian island, right? This sort of people that are cast upon this area that we would have called wilderness until military or industry sort of encroached on it. The people are sort of the bind, and as a photographer, the thing that I'm sort of most interested in, right? I'm a photographer, not a writer, so it's never for me, although as a person, I care deeply about Rebecca, everyone we're gonna show here, and stories, and those relationships. As a photographer, I'm sort of more interested in a little bit more mystery. And the portraits are what sort of make it just sort of messy enough and human enough and tangible enough to sort of keep me interested, I guess. Just a little bit of sort of technical talk for a moment. The portraits of the students, the very first year I went up in, was it 2017, I believe, to Camp 18. I went up with a digital camera, made a slew of pictures, came home, gave many of those pictures to JERP, shared most of those pictures, if all of them, with the students. Had an amazing time, met, 50 amazing people. One of the best 2 weeks of my life, those first 2 weeks. But really came home and started looking at pictures and was just really struggling trying to connect with anything. It just didn't feel like there was just something that was not quite right. And I have spent a lot of time making portraits with a 4x5 view camera, right? So a large format 4x5 inch sheet film camera, dark cloth over your head, looking at the ground glass, images upside down and inverted. You're on a tripod. It's very slow. It's very formal. And I took that camera up the next season with black and white sheets of film and sat with each student and made formal portraits of, and I've done this since, made formal portraits of each student in the landscape, sort of an opportunity for just one-on-one or maybe in small groups for us to sort of steal away for a bit and just talk about the landscape and talk about art and talk about portraiture and what I'm working on and what they're working on. And in the slowness of that and in connecting with that camera and sort of that moment, not to get so sort of techie with the camera being the thing, but it has sort of have been the sort of the tool that's been kind of critical in portraiture for me to sort of been able to slow down, but then also put the students, I think, in sort of a position where it feels not maybe so much novel or important, but it just feels like there's a moment being shared and that it's more of a collaboration, right? That we're sitting down, we're making something together. And we'll talk about sort of black and white and color here in a moment. But the students have been, and crossing the students, sort of that close formal images of the students with this sort of wide, pulled back landscapes and that sort of tension and that push and pull. Oftentimes I'll set up the camera and sort of position them and kind of just tell them to sort of relax, and we'll be talking, and I'll be under the dark cloth and sort of working on focus and sort of making sure that we're sort of there, really shallowed up the focus, and tell them I don't need them in that moment to sort of sit still, but sort of recognize where they are, because when they are gonna have to sit still, like it's gonna be, could be a second exposure, and if they move, it'll be blurry. And I'm sort of under the dark cloth with a loop on the glass, sort of looking at the whites of their eyes, and we're talking, but they may not even sort of recognize that I'm looking at them at the time. And I have them I get them sort of where I generally want them to be. And then a lot of the times I'll step out behind the cloth and ask if they want to switch roles, and I'll go sit where they are and have them get behind the glass and see me there and inverted and sort of have the conversation of kind of both sides of that lens. And then I ask them to look very clearly, directly to the shutter, right? And give me something that feels honest, and I don't want something that's happy. I don't want something that's sad. I'm not looking for brooding. I just want something that feels compatible with like the moment that we're having, right? Like we're having a serious conversation. It's just the two of us. We're in this landscape that we both revere greatly. And I'm on the other side thinking about that gaze that's coming through to me, but then ultimately as a photographer thinking about that ending print on the wall and that gaze going to, whoever that viewer is on the other end, confronting them face on. I am often, go kind of too far down this rabbit hole, but I'm often the oldest guy on the ice at any given time, right? It's a pretty young crew. And I just want to sort of give them, agency is not the right word, but I think in that landscape, it's always sort of smiles and people conquering a place, or it can be sort of, I think, frivolous at times, and I just want it to sort of calm it a bit. The decision to be all black and white with the portraits was that I hate like the colors of technical gear, right? This coat's yellow, right? Just drive me just absolutely crazy, right? Like I sort of think about them all having a similar weight, and if I were to put them all side by side on a wall and run 50 of them, frame the same size all together, that they should be able to sort of have a similar weight, right? And you can go to one and confront them eye to eye, go to the next one, confront them eye to eye, and the textures and the light and that gaze is what it's about. And if you stand back, that line is sort of a solid line, not broken by a red coat or a yellow coat or sort of the sort of knowing of the season's colors of, whatever industry that's making the gear, right? Some of them sort of intuitively get that after a while, and they'll show up not in puffy coats, but in, flannels and scarves. And I never say anything, but I secretly absolutely adore that. Because I don't want to like direct. I don't tell them at all what to wear. Like that's entirely up to them. But not that Christopher is not great, but. And again, large format camera, film, very slow process. Jason here was probably a second and a half of that exposure. If we were looking at a print real tight, there's just a little bit of movement in her eyes, just a little bit soft, but yeah, champ. And Birdie. Maddie. Megan. Anna. Just right up the hill from us here. I did a small show. We did actually a few days of we did a JERP science talk with Chris McNeil. Some of you might have gone to that at the library in the Valley a couple years ago. And I had a small show of this work at the City Museum, and we sort of used that as kind of this catalyst to do a bunch of JERP programming. We did a story night at Amalga, and we did a panel lecture with Annika Ord and Hannah Mode and Kevin Meyer at the City Museum. And this picture was actually in that show. It was a color picture at the time. The beauty of digital, that we can kind of move back and forth between color and Sophia, color and black and white. Marisa will kind of hustle through VJ. When I first started this project, I kind of thought, I always start thinking that the project's going to look away, right? Like it's going to look, I can kind of see what it's going to look like at the end. It's kind of sort of has shape to it. And then it always goes, this way and that way, and I sort of tweak this, and I run down this rabbit hole, and that doesn't work, and then I go this, and I'm like, oh, that's kind of silly. And oftentimes I do all those things, and then it always kind of comes back around to sort of generally where I started, but I kind of need to run down all those little alleys just to sort of know that things aren't going to work or to keep me interested. I don't know. But at the beginning, it was the portraits were always going to be black and white, and the landscapes were always going to be color. But I struggled in retrospect with it from the very beginning. Mainly because of the sky on the ice field, right? When you go up there and you're up there for a week and it's nothing but blue sky, it's a glorious week, but it's horrible for making pictures, right? Like it's just horrible. It's just garish and it's bright and it's just sort of, anyway, I yearn for fog, and I yearn for, that sort of half hour on either side of the day of sort of magic light. So backtrack a bit here. Well, first let's talk about, let's before I do that, go to the very beginning. and sort of this idea of blue, and then we'll kind of talk about this shift and kind of make it a little bit about photography for a minute, and then we'll get back to JERP specifically. The Light That Got Lost, the title of this work, comes from a phrase in a Rebecca Solnit essay called The Blue of Distance, from this book of essays called The Field Guide to Getting Lost. And I know this is sort of corny. I'm just going to read this for a moment. This piece by Rebecca Solnit, these 2 paragraphs. So this world is blue at its edges and in its depths. This blue is the light that got lost. Light at the blue end of the spectrum does not travel the whole distance from the sun to us. It disperses among the molecules of air. It scatters in water. Water is colorless. Shallow water appears to be the color of whatever lies beneath it, but deep water is full of this scattered light. The purer the water, the deeper the blue. The sky is blue for the same reason, the blue at the horizon, the blue of land that seems to be dissolving into the sky, a deeper, dreamier, melancholy blue, the blue of the farthest reaches of the places where you see for miles, the blue of distance. This light does not touch us, does not travel the whole distance. The light that gets lost gives us the beauty of the world, so much of which is in the color blue. For many years, I've been moved by the blue at the far edge of what can be seen, the color of horizons, of remote mountain ranges, of anything far away. The color of that distance is the color of an emotion, the color of solitude, and the color of desire. The color of there seen from here, the color of where you are not, and the color of where you can never go. For the blue is not the place those miles away at the horizon, but in the atmospheric distance between you and the mountains. I love Rebecca Solnit dearly. Not just this essay and this book, but several that she's written. I always found it fascinating in these 2 paragraphs. She uses that term, the light that got lost, twice, which, if you know Solnit, is sort of unlike her to sort of to have that phrase repeat itself. I always just thought was not strange but curious. And it's something that rattled around in my head for a really long time, from back when I was first making the work, and sort of adopted it for the title of the work. And I've kind of come to realize lately that atmospheric distance is one of the things with the color photographs that I was sort of struggling with. But this picture, just quickly, was kind of the thing that did it for me. The water catchment system at Camp 17 a few years ago, 2019, I believe. I made this picture, digital camera. Doesn't work for a million different reasons. I've always been really captivated by these little snow drifts. Sometimes they're big chunks of snow, sometimes they're a whole field of snow, sometimes there's these little pieces depending on the season and the camp that we're at and the time of the year, and how much snow we had over the winter. But these, this snow pile that gets smaller and smaller and smaller as the students and the rest of the crew become more hydrated over the 2 weeks they're in camp. And the blue tarp, the sort of symbol of Alaska. Certainly Fairbanks, different story. I did a whole project on blue tarps when I was in Fairbanks for a bunch of years. That D and 4 people are maybe the only people that have ever seen it. But it's anyways, it's a picture that didn't work for me, right, for a bunch of different reasons. But I made this picture while I was setting up, waiting on a portrait, making a portrait of a student, and they had to run off and do something related to the program. And I made this picture, just sort of not thinking an awful lot. But I turned the 4x5 that I only use for portraits, and I made this picture as well with the 4x5 on 4x5 sheet of film. And I forgot about it, didn't remember that I made it. It sat in a box. I processed all of the portraits. I think I probably looked at the negative and this isn't worth scanning. It's not worth my time. I put it back in the box. And during COVID, I was going back and rescanning some negatives, and I stumbled across this again, and I scanned it, and I thought it was just sort of wonderful. And the things that I was sort of looking for on that day that didn't work in the color photograph, they did in this picture. And during COVID, not doing an awful lot else, I went back and I went through thousands of pictures, seeing if there were pictures that I had discarded or forgot about or decided weren't worthy based on the light, based on color. and flip them into mono and try to see if I could find a different access to them, if I could find a different relationship to them. And I not only found that, but realized or recognized that it opened up an entire, even though I was stripping color from the pictures, it opened an entire palette and continuity that I just didn't know was sort of available at the time. And since then, the work has been, and not to say that some color pictures may not find their way in, but it's all found itself in a black and white palette. This picture of Abby at a different catchment at Camp 17, but a different year. That blue tarp and that blue sky, her in the center of the frame. She isn't sort of overwhelmed and surrounded by and sort of kind of held, constrained by. Camp 18, top of the Taku Glacier. This is, I forget his name for a second. Jason sweeping the Hilton, the name of that building. Towels from the cook shack and various clothes drying on rocks at Camp 18. This is not during the summer field season. This is also Camp 17 in April 2020. I volunteer for spring and fall field seasons up at Lemon Glacier with Chris McNeil, who was here a couple years ago doing a lecture with USGS. He goes up and does mass balance studies on the Lemon Glacier each spring and fall, and then the students do them in the summer, so it's a 3-time-a-year process. Anyway, that was in April, pretty nasty storm. Chris McNeil. More aerials. This is Emperor Peak across the Taku Glacier from Camp 18. Or excuse me, from Camp 10, excuse me. Camp 18, this is the Gilkey Glacier, Gilkey Trench that we're looking down into. If you take the Gilkey down eventually into Berners Bay. Over my shoulder, my right shoulder, is the Storm Range. Just beyond that is the Canadian border. Skagway's this direction. Taku River is that direction. Town is that direction. The program's 75 years old. Started by Maynard Miller here locally. I wasn't fortunate enough to meet Maynard before he died. So much history with this program. Each one of these camps has a library with just reams and reams and reams of student thesis and journals. Annie, the director, when she's up there, she'll pull a journal off of the shelf, and after dinner each night just read on this day in 1951. And it's just, mostly crazy men doing stupid stuff, The thigh call in the foreground here in that little patch of snow. There's 3 of them up there right now. That one still runs, and each year they'll just, start it up and maybe drive it around a bit just to kind of keep it going. Sort of legendary story. There's an ice fall off to the left here. There's actually 2, the Von Lewis splits, and there's ice falls on either side of the Nunatak here. And that thigh call in 51 or 52, they had it down to the ice fall and went through a snow bridge and got it stuck in a crevasse. And they dismantled it into pieces that they could carried it back up to Camp 18 and rebuilt it. Anyway. Crazy. More aerials. Sometimes you see things in the ice. You think about things like changing don't know if anybody else sees this, but flying by with coastal that day, it looked like an angel to me. And I don't know how long that patch of ice lasted. I mean, not through the season, right? Whatever it looked like the next year didn't look like that. But yeah, anyway. This is on the rim of Avalanche Canyon. Avalanche Canyon is north of Camp 10 up the Taku, and then sort of this big U-shaped valley that spills into the Gilkey. And it's full of wildflowers and little brush, and it's the most miraculous place that sits out in the middle of snow and ice on, you know, every side, and then you come to this rim and you come up over the edge and it's just lush, and there's 1,000 little wildflowers. The one thing that I regret black and white photography, these wonderful little wildflowers that you'll see this little clump of like purple wildflowers that you've never seen before in your life, and then you'll never see a clump like that again. But you'll see another little clump of purple ones that are a different, you know, different species, different genus, whatever, that are completely different. It's miraculous. Taku Range. This is heading back off to Camp 18. The camps on the ice field are numbered in sequence to when they were built, which is why sometimes it's sort of confusing. The Lemon Glacier, Camp 17, and then we go to Camp 10, and then we go to Camp 18, and then to 28. Most of the smaller, like 9 and 8, 7, 6, most of those camps aren't around anymore. Students sleeping out on the cleaver at Camp 18. This is in the morning. This last season. Just last year. The first year back from COVID, Allie here tested positive for COVID while we were on the ice at Camp 18. Her and another student were spending the nights sleeping on top of the thigh call at Camp 10 just to isolate themselves. They loved it. By the time you're at Camp 10, you've spent 4 or 5 weeks with, you know, a big mass of young people that haven't showered very much, and you're staying in buildings that have spent most of the year under piles of snow and are sort of moldy and pretty dank. And I would imagine getting permission to sleep outside on the thigh call was not a bad consolation for testing positive for COVID up there. Eli getting water at Camp 18. Filling water for cooking that night. This is what Tori and VJ working on some projects. This is looking down off the cleaver at Camp 18. So this is the Taku Glacier, Taku Range across the glacier, and this is a trail party coming in from the previous camp, Camp 17. It takes 2 days to get across, and this is sort of the first sight of them before they come into camp. Von Lewis Glacier crevasses up at Camp 18. Big melt pond on the Taku a couple years ago. Huge. I mean, this room and both galleries and the atrium, at least, of melt water right out in the middle of the glacier. Again, Camp 10 in the Taku Range. Sits up on this big Nunatak. Most of these, buildings, most of the camps were built in proximity to the ice. And at the time that they were built, you could, more or less, I don't know so much about Camp 10. Camp 17, if you've been up to Camp 17, like at the Lemon Glacier, where the library is built there, kind of right as you kind of roll over down to the Lemon. When they built that camp, you could walk out of the library and essentially walk right onto the ice. And now it's you know, I don't know, 1,000 feet down. To go back for a second, we'll wrap up here in a second, but to go back to a minute with the start of Maynard Miller and starting this program, originally on Army funding and research and sort of Arctic training, that eventually he evolved into a science and research program. You know, Jackie and I were talking on the radio the other day that I often feel that like the work that I'm making over the years, I start a new project and I sort of think that it's different, and I think that I'm sort of taking different chances or thinking about different things, and then I always find at the end of the day that I've been working on the same thing for 25 years, right? That sort of all of these projects are linked in one way or another. You know, I sort of feel like when I start that there's something different. You know, the project at ADAC, for instance, that original World War II infrastructure and sort of the timing of those buildings, the timing of Maynard Miller in the beginning of this program on the ice field, they sort of started sort of from a similar place, right? And they sort of almost started in a similar landscape, but in ADAC it was a decision, economic decision, like to walk away and let those buildings rot. Here they were fashioned for something positive, right? They were made to have a legacy beyond their birth, as it were. Outside classes on Taku D. Yibai, our field manager, safety manager. This is the library at Camp 17 in the winter, not the summer. Inside the library. Xenoliths at Camp 18. Almost done here. We'll open up for questions. I know this was sort of fast, and we talk a minute about JERP here at the very end, but I just want to offer up a couple more pictures here. So I talked about being up on the ice field and sort of having that couple weeks or a week or 3 weeks worth of picture making, and making pictures, and then spending kind of a whole year to work on other things, but to look at those pictures and sort of edit those pictures and have some sort of understanding of what they mean and how they relate to the year before, and piecing things together. Those very first pictures that I was making at the Mendenhall, and sort of thinking about the valley and thinking about what was left after the glacier recedes, and then going up on the ice and spending that time. I've been sort of working on that kind of a different, kind of a different door into that same room or that same question, and driving around Mendenhall Valley looking for erratics. If you live in the valley and you see some strange guy snooping around your backyard, if you have an erratic in your backyard, that's probably me. And again, just thinking about the landscape that is, that was left by that glacier. The program of JERP is changing every year. 2 years ago, the program has always, on the ski to Camp 10 from Camp 17 out of Lemon Glacier, it's always left the same route to get off of the glacier. Every year it's gone the same way down glacier in this certain route up this little valley. And a couple years ago, could no longer do that route because it was all blue ice, right? It had melted out too much. There's no way to get out of Lemon Glacier in the way that it had been done for 72 years. Now we get up on the ridge further up glacier. And there was a time when JERP used to be in the 4th of July parade. And I see people every once in a while and say, why don't you guys do the parade anymore, right? What's that? Yeah, well, we missed the parade too. And the reason why we don't do the parade anymore is because the program now starts around the 18th to the 19th of June, because we can't stay on the ice field any later. It's getting that much more difficult to get in and out of Camp 18, out of Camp 10. And Camp 18 will be almost impossible to get in and out of in the next decade. So those buildings that have been around for 75 years, I mean, updated, right? But the initial buildings that were built with convenient access obviously aren't convenient anymore. The timing of the program isn't convenient anymore. These erratics are sort of outside of the program, just sort of thinking about what life and what the landscape looks sort of post program, post ice. I think I said this at the very beginning, wrap it up here, but in the fall, we're going to do a JERP, sort of an evening, kind of a state of the ice field evening. Chris is going to come back down and talk about the science that's being done up there and sort of a very sort of scientific kind of boots on the ground. What does the ice field look like now? And a past, present, future of the program. What is JERP up to? What are our plans for the future? We'll be doing that in the fall, probably November. So kind of keep an eye out for that. If you came tonight wanting a bunch more sort of JERP specific information, I apologize. It's sort of more pictures than anything. We can do some questions about photography, about the landscape, about JERP, whatever you guys want. I really appreciate your time tonight. Thank you.
Got the mic if people have questions.
When did you take that picture?
That was in 2019. Yeah. Waiting for the snow to thaw to get back and make another one from right there. Yeah, 2019.
So I'm sitting here right in the middle, and all through the show, I was looking at this photo, and then I was looking at that photo, and they were the same photos, and we know that never really, this might not be on, but it's, you know what I'm talking about. You can see different things when you see different photos from different perspectives. These aren't so much different. I noticed the last, for me at least, I don't know if my eyes got trained or not, but especially the first 2/3 of this, when I went back and forth, everything was different. And even though I look at a lot of photos, I had a hard time matching them up. Some of them there was one not too long ago, one of the camps there was a small group of people arriving at camp.
Yep.
On this photo, they looked 3 times as big as on that photo,
Oh.
even though it was the same photo.
Oh.
And it's a lot of, I finally decided it was just the black versus white perspective, but it completely changed how I was looking at the photos. And it might be useful to do that sometime, just to sit here and do that, because it's pretty amazing.
Yeah, that's interesting. I think as a photographer, if there's photographers or artists in here, in the room, I go through that exercise with my work, and actually with other people's work if I have the opportunity to, quite a bit, right? Print in different scales. You know, like everything when I start out is little 4x5 prints. You know, like digital pictures are great, folders of things, but little 4x5 prints, tacked up, taped up, laying on the floor, spread around everywhere. And then once you start printing larger, that scale is total game changer. You know, you see things that you didn't know were there. Some things work small, don't work large, and vice versa. You know, that play is, I always find, sort of fascinating, and why I love the print. You know, like photographers that only view images online, they're just missing so much. Put it on paper, tear it up, wad it up, make big ones, make little ones. You know, put them side by side. Like, what's that? Like with some of these, you know, they weren't all centered. I had some over here and some over there, and that's just sort of thinking about books too, you know, the act of opening that book and what happens when you know, this picture is this picture, this picture is this picture, what happens, you put them together, that conversation makes something else entirely, right? which is where I'm at now, just editing, like what's the conversation, how do they communicate, what, yeah, anyway. Anybody else? Thank you, Bill.
Thanks, Ben. I really enjoyed this.
Thanks, Jonas, appreciate it.
I was just thinking about, those portraits were really striking and different. You talked about the human quality of otherwise like really landscape and place-based photos. I'm just curious if you ever think about like integrating those conversations you're having with the subjects of those portraits like into a show or something, like, what they're thinking about, what's going through their minds while they're trying not to look too somber or too brightly colored or
Totally.
whatnot.
Yeah, it's such an interesting question. I have broached that with them, right? I've had them write thoughts for me before. It's a really slippery slope. And there's a couple things in that I have a problem with it. It's hard enough for me to sort of the students always show up and they're wonderful and they give me exactly what I ask of them, right? If a picture doesn't work, it's because I messed something up, you know what I mean, right? Like there's, something's wrong technically, light-wise, like something happened that, it's hard enough sort of choosing some pictures and not choosing others. When you get into like text and someone's reflections and someone's viewpoints, it gets so much more complicated, and I try, as weird as this sounds, and I'm still sort of kind of working through it on my own too. What I don't, how do I put this? It'd be really easy as the photographer to sort of levy all of sort of my ideas on their likeness. You know what I mean? And I don't want to do that. So my reaction to that is to just sort of strip everything back. And that includes, I think, that sort of narrative from the subject. I'm still battling with it.
Thank
but
you.
But I understand the question, and it's, totally valid and something I think about quite a bit.
Yeah, just do what you can do. Let them stay alone.
Yeah. Anybody else?
Ben, I've got a question for
Please.
you.
Yeah.
For some reason, I mentioned this the other day, the switch to black and white with your work. I'm noticing you're working with a lot of these photos, in the value scale, you've got some high key photos and then you've got some low key photos. And the subtlety of your values you're working with, that sort of sensitivity to the tonality within the darks. Did you find when you switched from color to black and white, was that already there, or were you looking at it differently when you went from color to black and white?
Good question. They're totally different. Pictures that worked as color didn't work as black and white. Now I shoot them as black and white. Like now I'm thinking about them as black and white. If it's a digital capture, I'm looking at them as black and white on the back of the camera, right? Like I'm trying to think without the color. That initial, though, sort of change and going back through the archive and figuring out if some worked and if some didn't was a lot bigger challenge than I thought. And some good pictures, good color pictures I just had to kind of get rid of them because they didn't work. You know what I mean? A lot of COVID was the 4x5 film portraits and the digital landscapes, and trying to make them feel as though they came from the same place. You know what I mean? Trying to make them just from a feel, from a tonality, not have it be so stark that they came from a different camera. Before I didn't have to worry about it. Portraits were in black and white, digital were in color. They could sort of feel like two different things that I sort of bound together under a title. But yeah, when I shifted everything to mono, I kind of had to be, a little bit more sort of diligent in, not diligence, not the right word, but yeah, it's a process. Yeah. Anybody else? Oh.
Go this way.
Good evening. Thanks for sharing this with us.
Yeah,
really
thank you.
Interesting. At the beginning of the presentation, you talked a lot about your process with the portraits and how you set those up and how you built those images.
Mm-hmm.
And then towards the end of the presentation, you had all these really fantastic images that appeared more candid.
Mm-hmm.
And I was just wondering if you could speak to how you think about your process with those more candid photos.
Yeah, it's a good question. I've actually in the last couple years made a really concerted effort. Hi, Zach, former student Zach, walking out the door. Yeah, actually the last couple years I've made. I recognize that there was sort of a gap in sort of people in the landscape on a smaller scale, you know. And being really deliberate in having them not be as formal, right? That they definitely know that I'm there. I may even ask them, hold that for a second, or hey, what you were doing a second ago, why don't you, do you have any reason to do that again? You know what I mean? That kind of thing. So there's I wouldn't call it directing, but I'm with the camera all the time. Like they know that they're kind of being, that sounds creepy. They know they're being watched. I don't mean it like that, but they know that we're sort of in collaboration and that I'm always sort of, there and making pictures. But yeah, there's a conscious effort to make portraits that are not as formal and that are, I wouldn't say action, there's still sort of a stillness to it. But it's kind of one of them kind of doesn't work without the other, like at the beginning there, the sort of the vertical portraits, the vertical former portraits, and the vertical aerials of the wide back landscapes. I like that. Like I like those in prints. I like those sort of as almost as objects on a wall. Like the two of those are nice together. From a narrative standpoint, they kind of don't work without those same people being smaller in the frame, actively in the landscape or in the architecture or doing something. The thing that I've struggled with I'm still sort of figuring out how it works. So many pictures of students and of faculty in science endeavors, right? Like doing technical work. And some of those pictures, I don't really have anything in this here, but some of them that are like the more ambiguous, the better, they're digging a hole, they're planting a stake, they've got some sort of instrument, right? Some of those are sort of interesting because they're mysterious, but then some of them, I think, just sort of have the potential just to sort of take the viewer, somewhere. So yeah, very, very deliberate. Some of them work, some of them don't. But that was a good catch. Yeah, thanks. I mean, it's and those far away ones are something that have been kind of a focus the last couple, for whatever that's worth, last couple years. Yeah, thanks. Anybody else? Jay?
Thanks, Ben.
Yeah.
On your choice of words, you say make a picture, and I think about that looking at these, and it's like, oh yes, it's very active. You're composing, creating something rather than the more passive thing that I think about using my, like the monkey with my cell phone taking a picture. Was that a term that you kind of drifted towards or like chose or arrived at partway through? Or I guess if you have any other thoughts kind of around that, I found it interesting and wondered if you had any other thoughts.
Yeah, it's not a novel thing. I'm not the only one that does it. But I think that there's part of it comes from the 4x5, I think, in that I think a lot about collaboration, right? And sort of making is, especially the portraiture, like inviting someone else into that action, right? And then I also sort of feel like just the nature of photography in general, these terms that we have, take and shoot and capture, like it's just so aggressive and not, it's just incongruent with what I'm trying to do, and as me, like we're trying to do, you know what I mean, right? Whether it's a cell phone or whether it's an 8x10 or whatever it is. So make just feels more, I don't know, respectful, I guess. Yeah, good question though. Yeah, yep. Yeah. Anybody else? No? Jay?
First of all, thanks, Ben.
Here
You're
it
really
comes.
good at
Yeah,
this. We all
thanks, buddy.
appreciate it. And you talked about projects, and sometimes you, what's going on? What's in your brain for
What's
anything
that?
else? Anything else you're thinking about besides?
I'm always thinking about things, Jay.
Then you say you sometimes you leak a little bit of it
What's that? What do you mean?
in the beginning.
At the beginning?
I thought you said that you would.
No. No, I'm always, I don't know exactly where you're going here. No, did I try to say I was going to give something away earlier? No, I think Jackie and I were talking the other day about projects. Actually, Boston on the radio the other day made a comment about what did he say, something, and I wanted to continue that conversation with him so much, but he asked when we were on K2, he sort of said something almost in passing, and then we went on to something else, but he said something about like projects and like you must change a lot or the world must change a lot or something during a project, and it's something I've been thinking a lot about lately is you know, Last Road North was about 5 years worth of work, and Atomic Island was about 5 years worth of work, and this project is well over 5 now, but but the actual making of the pictures is so small, you know? But like so much in life and stuff changes during the time of making those projects, you know what I mean, right? And sort of this idea that when you start, you kind of have this idea of what it's going to be. And the reason that you kind of do all these things in the middle and think that maybe it's going to be something different is that like the world changes, you know, and what you thought you were going to make or what you thought was your interest or the direction you thought you were headed sometimes isn't the thing, you know what I mean, right? I kind of always find, again, like I always kind of feel like I come back to the beginning because the beginning was the reason I started making the pictures. Excuse me, it was the excitement, it was the whatever that got me sort of out the door and finally said, I'm going to do this thing. But there's always, I mean, it's, you know, it's years of just other stuff that's not photography that doesn't get in the way, but it changes your perception of things, you know? And when I finish something, you always look back and say, not, oh, I could have done that better. It's not that, but you say, oh, given what I know now, I could have done that 6 or 8 different ways. And it might have been better, could have been worse, could have been different. You can't change it, you know what I mean? This project is different in that the Hall Road project, you know, those people that I met I knew every portrait that I made during that project, I knew I'd never see that person again for the most part. They were traveling that road, I met them on the road, they were strangers, I made a portrait. We went our separate ways. Some of them I kept in touch with, and I've sent them prints and things, but I've never seen them again. ADAC, I went back each time. Maybe I'd stay with somebody. I still kind of not kept my distance, that's not quite right, but you know, I knew that at some point I was going to stop making those pictures and I probably wouldn't go to ADAC again, right? Like I may, but I don't really have any reason to, you know. I love that place. I love the people that I met there. I have a great fondness for that place, but I went and I sort of made what I wanted to make, told the story I wanted to tell, and I left. This is different in that there's sort of relationships, and I have responsibilities within the program, and there are things outside of the picture making that complicates it in a really interesting way that I haven't had to deal with yet, which didn't entirely answer your question, but yeah, anyway. Yeah. Anybody else?
Thanks, it's really interesting, your process.
Thank you.
There's a couple of pictures you were talking about erratics.
Yeah, yeah.
I almost, is that like another project? I mean, it's like so weird, those are like these lost rocks, like what are
Yeah.
what are they doing?
Yeah, I don't know if it's another project. And I kind of have, unlike me, I kind of have lately just given up thinking about whether it is a different project. And I just say that because it then enables me to go out and do other different things that are either directly related to or sort of tangential to that landscape and ideas. You know what I mean? It's a great question, and for a long time, I very often invariably talk myself out of things. You know, like I'll think about something, think about it, I'm like, oh, that's stupid, oh, that's dumb, oh, you know, and then eventually one day I'm just like, oh, for fuck, just go make those pictures. You've been talking about and hem and haw about it for years. The erratics were sort of one of those, and I'm kind of trying to put that sort of part of myself to bed and just, you know, it is or it isn't. I enjoy making them and I think it's interesting, and whether it can kind of wrap in to sort of the umbrella of is the light that got lost, or whether it's something else, you know, at this point I don't really need to know. But yeah, it's a good question. Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I appreciate everyone's time tonight, really, truly. Thank you.